What if I told you there was once a king so disfigured, so mentally broken, so spiritually tormented, that his very existence blurred the line between medicine and myth? Not a tale from folklore, but a real monarch who ruled one of the most powerful empires in Europe. His jaw couldn't close. His limbs barely worked. His mind was like that of a child. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, and many believed he was cursed by the devil himself. But the true horror wasn't demonic. It was hereditary. This is the haunting story of Charles II of Spain, a king shaped not by war or conquest, but by centuries of royal inbreeding that turned a throne into a death sentence. You're about to witness the slow collapse of a dynasty through the life of one tragic man. He was born into a palace, but destined for a lifetime of suffering. When Charles II of Spain entered the world in 1661, he was hailed as the heir to one of Europe's greatest empires. But even as an infant, the whispers began. Something wasn't right. His cries were feeble. His limbs were limp. His head was alarmingly large. Midwives looked to the queen with silent dread, afraid to voice the thoughts they dared not speak aloud. The future of Spain might already be broken. Charles was born of royal blood, too much of it. His father, King Philip IV, had married his own niece. His grandparents had done the same. Generation after generation, the Habsburgs intermarried, believing they were preserving divine bloodlines. Instead, they were concentrating genetic defects like poison in a cup. And Charles? He was the result. Foreign envoys who arrived to pay homage were stunned. The King of Spain, head of an empire stretching across Europe and the Americas, couldn't even close his mouth. His lower jaw jutted out so grotesquely that his lips remained permanently parted, exposing crooked, misaligned teeth. This was no minor deformity. It was a symbol, a visual curse, a royal jaw sculpted by centuries of incest. The infamous Habsburg jaw. His speech was nearly impossible to understand. Words tumbled out like wet clay, slurred and garbled. His courtiers strained to interpret him. Foreign dignitaries required translators, not for language, but for comprehension. It was as if the king's own mouth refused to obey him. This wasn't merely embarrassing. It was catastrophic. Every royal proclamation, every public address, was a struggle. A king who couldn't speak clearly couldn't command respect. He was mocked in foreign courts, feared in his own. Meals became ceremonies of humiliation. Palace chefs mashed and pureed every dish to the consistency of baby food. Even then, much of it ended up spilling from the corners of his mouth. Servants hovered constantly, dabbing at his chin with linen cloths as he drooled through dinners meant to display royal splendor. Solid food was out of the question. Chewing was impossible. The very act of feeding the king became a grotesque public display, witnessed by nobles who tried, and failed, to mask their revulsion. His mother, Queen Mariana, watched with quiet terror. In her private letters, she confessed her greatest fear, that Charles might choke to death in his sleep. His tongue, too large for his deformed mouth, threatened to block his throat as he lay motionless at night. They placed attendants at his bedside, not to guard him, but to ensure he kept breathing. But Charles's physical ailments were only the beginning. As he grew, it became clear that something far deeper was wrong. While other children began to crawl, Charles remained motionless. While toddlers took their first steps, Charles stayed seated, limbs too weak to bear his weight. He did not walk until the age of 8. Imagine that, a prince crawling through palace halls, too fragile to stand. His growth was stunted, his proportions unnatural. His head ballooned in size, bobbing atop a neck that couldn't support it. His torso hunched. His limbs dangled like twigs. He stood barely over 5 feet tall, and even then, he stumbled constantly, relying on walls and furniture to stay upright. He moved not with the dignity of a monarch, but with the faltering steps of a man decades older. Courtiers wrote of him lurching from one side of the room to another, breathless and trembling. His tutors were baffled. Charles couldn't read, couldn't write. Lessons vanished from his mind as quickly as they were taught. They described the experience as pouring water into a shattered vessel. No matter how much they gave him, he retained nothing. His intellect hovered at the level of a child's. When frustrated, he threw tantrums. He would scream, kick, and even bite, like a toddler denied a toy. And when the rage passed, he would retreat into eerie stillness, silent for hours, staring into the distance, vacant and unreachable. Even his appearance defied royalty. His skin was sallow, his hair fell out in tufts, leaving bald patches that gave his head the look of a diseased animal. Painters tasked with capturing his image were forced to invent flattering angles, hiding the worst of his deformities. But the truth could never be fully erased. Spain's king was a prisoner of his own body. Yet despite all this, there was one task he had to fulfill: produce an heir. And that, perhaps, became the cruelest chapter of all. Charles married at 18. His bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived in Spain full of youthful optimism. She had been told she would marry a king. Instead, she found herself wedded to a man who looked and acted like a broken boy. The wedding night was a nightmare. According to palace servants, Marie-Louise emerged from the bedchamber in tears. Charles seemed disoriented and confused. Medical records later confirmed what whispers had already suggested. Charles's genitals were severely underdeveloped. He was, in every biological sense, still a child. Reproduction was impossible, but the Spanish court couldn't admit that. They blamed Marie-Louise instead. Doctors subjected her to invasive procedures. Herbalists gave her foul potions. She prayed desperately, day and night, for a miracle that would never come. Her health declined. Her spirit faded. The once vivacious princess became gaunt and sickly. Some believed she was slowly poisoned by the very treatments meant to heal her. At just 26 years old, she died mysteriously. Charles was devastated, or perhaps confused. No one truly knew what he felt. Soon, a second wife was brought in, Maria Anna of Neuburg. She too was young, hopeful, and quickly disillusioned. In private letters, she confessed her dread at her husband's condition. The court tried everything: doctors from across Europe, ancient fertility texts, even magic. Priests blessed their bed. Alchemists prescribed bizarre remedies. Still, nothing worked. Charles remained childless, and with no heir, the kingdom teetered on the edge of disaster. Other European powers began eyeing the throne, preparing to stake their claim. The continent waited, breath held, for the inevitable. But while others plotted, Spain's court turned inward, toward darkness. With no medical explanation for the king's worsening health, attention turned to the supernatural. Priests declared Charles possessed. The palace became a theater for exorcisms. Not in secret, but in public, in full view of nobles and diplomats. In the very halls of Spanish power, the king was laid bare, trembling, screaming, writhing on the floor as holy men shouted Latin incantations over his convulsing body. They made him drink water mixed with powdered relics. He gagged and vomited, his frail body shaking. They claimed this was proof that demons resisted the cure. Crucifixes were pressed to his skin. He was doused in holy water, forced to recite Latin prayers through slurred speech. At times, he collapsed from exhaustion, his mind too weak to comprehend what was happening. The priests believed the entire palace was cursed. They burned gifts, portraits, even furniture, convinced they harbored evil spirits. Bonfires roared in the palace courtyard as sacred chants echoed through the halls. And in the center of it all, Charles II, Spain's last hope, suffered in silence. He begged for more exorcisms. When they ended, he claimed he felt better. And for a short while, perhaps he did. Because when pain is constant, even cruelty can feel like relief. By the turn of the century, the shadows that had always lingered over Charles II grew darker, heavier, more suffocating. His body, already twisted and decaying, was beginning to collapse in ways that even the most desperate of priests or physicians could no longer ignore. His moments of lucidity were fewer and farther between. He would sit slumped in his throne for hours, blinking slowly, hands trembling in his lap, as if every breath he took required negotiation with death. Once the monarch of the vast Spanish Empire, he now resembled a ghost cloaked in royal garments, a brittle shell held together by ceremony, habit, and obligation. He was 38 years old, but looked twice that. His skin, once pale and waxy, had taken on a grayish hue, like parchment gone moldy. His limbs were so thin they seemed like twigs wrapped in skin, and his stomach bloated grotesquely with internal fluid. His eyes, sunken and rimmed in bruised purple, barely responded to the light. The few teeth he had left were blackened and loose. Court doctors tried every remedy they could imagine: bleedings, poultices, herbal concoctions, baths in perfumed water, but nothing worked. He was failing, dying, slowly, painfully, publicly. His condition became a national secret everyone knew. Rumors about his inability to function, even on a basic human level, spread through noble courts across Europe. Ambassadors wrote home in code, describing a man who drooled on himself during audiences, who sometimes forgot who he was speaking to mid-sentence. Diplomats spoke of whispered prayers at night, not for Charles's recovery, but for his swift end, to free the country from the prolonged agony of his reign. But Spain could not afford to let go. Not yet, because Charles's death meant something far more terrible than the end of a king. It meant the collapse of a dynasty and the beginning of a war. And so, the rituals continued. In his final months, Charles underwent a series of increasingly bizarre and brutal exorcisms. Not because anyone truly believed he was possessed, but because it was the only narrative that made sense of his suffering. He couldn't just be ill, he had to be cursed. It was easier to blame spirits than face the monstrous truth that his affliction had been designed by his own ancestors. Father Diaz, the chief exorcist, claimed he had uncovered the names of 47 demons inhabiting the king's body. One controlled his speech, another his digestion. One was said to twist his spine, another to poison his seed. These weren't metaphors. They were believed to be literal entities tormenting him from within. During these exorcisms, Charles was forced to drink more holy water laced with ash from burned saints' bones, and each session would leave him weaker than the last. Sometimes he would pass out entirely and wake up confused, gasping for air, clutching the crucifix hung around his neck like a talisman. The palace, once a symbol of opulence and strength, had become a house of dread. Servants tiptoed through the halls. Priests kept vigil through the night. Every creak in the floor, every moan from behind the royal chamber doors was met with superstitious dread. Some claimed to hear voices in the walls, or see shadowy figures dart through corridors when no one else was around. Whether it was madness or grief, the line between reality and delusion blurred more each day. By late 1700, Charles could no longer stand. His legs buckled beneath him, his balance gone. He was fed by hand, like a child. Sometimes he would weep when his food arrived, not because he was hungry, but because he could no longer bear the effort of eating. His body had become a prison, and he lacked the strength to even protest. Still, the court clung to hope. Every night, letters were dispatched to religious shrines across the empire, begging for relics, prayers, intervention from saints. They lit candles and wept before icons. But no divine mercy came. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II of Spain died. The king's death was not sudden. It was not peaceful. It was a slow retreat, like the tide pulling back from the shore. One by one, his organs stopped cooperating. His final breath came in the early morning hours. The room was silent. A servant quietly closed the king's mouth, something Charles had never been able to do on his own. His jaw slackened, and for the first time in his life, his lips met. An autopsy was performed, though not for medical understanding. The court needed answers. They needed proof that Charles had been more than a myth, more than a monster. But what they found only deepened the horror. The royal physician, Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pirola, led the examination. His notes were never meant to be public, but fragments leaked into history nonetheless, passed from hand to hand like cursed scripture. The findings stunned even the most seasoned medical minds. Charles's heart, they wrote, was no larger than a walnut. Instead of the strong, rhythmic pump of a monarch's lifeblood, it was withered and blackened, a shriveled lump incapable of sustaining a common peasant, let alone an emperor. His lungs were rotten, One partially collapsed, the other riddled with lesions and full of fluid that gave off a stench so foul several assistants vomited on the spot. His stomach and intestines were gangrenous, decaying from the inside out, a slow chemical rot that had likely been poisoning him for years. The most damning discoveries, however, were in his skull and pelvis. When they opened his head, they found the brain shrunken and surrounded by an abnormal quantity of fluid, what modern medicine now knows as hydrocephalus. His brain tissue was discolored, soft in places, degraded. No wonder he could barely read, or speak, or remember. His brain had been drowning for decades. As for the organs of reproduction, they were stunted to the point of being described as infantile. There had never been any hope of children. The line had ended long before Charles took the throne. The final words of the physician's report, now infamous among historians, were simple. This body contained not a single sound part, and it is a wonder it had lived as long as it did. But death did not bring peace to Spain. It brought war. Charles had died without an heir. And though he had written a will naming Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor, the other royal houses of Europe would not accept that without resistance. The Habsburgs of Austria, who had watched the decline of their Spanish cousins with increasing unease, declared that the French claim was invalid. The English, Dutch, and Portuguese aligned with them. What followed was not a succession, it was a continental explosion. The War of Spanish Succession tore across Europe. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the century, fought not for land or liberty, but for legacy. It lasted over a decade. Hundreds of thousands died. Cities burned. Alliances shattered. Treaties were signed, broken, and rewritten in blood. And all of it traced back to a malformed child born into a doomed dynasty, bred from a royal obsession with purity that turned into a genetic death spiral. The Habsburgs had spent centuries guarding their bloodline, marrying within it to keep power consolidated. But in the end, their pursuit of control ensured their destruction. Charles II, the king who couldn't walk, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't reproduce, and barely functioned, was their final legacy.